Fucking Jesus, smells like death. Oh, what's that fucking smell? Oh, smells like fucking shit. Oh, I like it. Thank you, Jesus. You smell like shit. You smell like dirty cunt. I like it. Oh, filth. Surrounded by filth. Beautiful fucking filth. Thank you, Jesus, for filth. Fucking filth. Beautiful fucking filth.
To do all the things that I knew I wanted to do deep down, but was too, I didn't necessarily have the courage at the time to really listen to that.
Could you seem like such an intuitive person now?
I am now, yeah, and at the time I was in that stage where I was really curious to get to know more about myself, so that kind of just pulled me on.
So did you kind of go over to her place and just have a chat?
It was actually over a Skype call.
Wow.
We had about 5 conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah, just sent me because I always wanted to be a singer as well, but I was really like, I told myself when I was like in year, I got around 9 or 10 or something, I made a vow to myself that I would never sing around people ever again, not even in school, nothing. But I played guitar, and like I loved playing guitar, I played acoustic guitar all the time, and I always wanted to sing.
So fucking boring. So fucking sick. So in line with the will of God. Fucking disgusting. How out of line with the will of God. That's beautiful, I like it. I feel that's in tune with the will of God. The rocking wounded, they come to this diver of the heart of multitudes. An Exxon blue, radiation gold, ecstasy. Now you tell me how you gonna get to do it dirty when all the sleeves are free. The rocking wounded, they come to the diver of the multitudes in Exxon blue, and radiation the dirty one. And all the sleeves are free. That's just darling sunny.
Mills that turn logs into value-add wood is in distress. Or put another way, why are we selling raw logs to China without turning them into something more valuable first? You're the executive director of Sequel, which is a wood processing factory in Kawerau. So you are just down the road from Whakatane Board Mills, really, aren't you? About 20 minutes drive away.
Yes,
Are you in distress at all?
we're definitely not in distress, but what I'd say is that there should be 10 businesses like Sequel in New Zealand, not one.
Why is that?
So what we do is we process utility grade logs, so we're the only sawmill in New Zealand that focuses on utility grade logs, so we're competing specifically with the same logs that go to China. In reality, the surplus wood available that we have in New Zealand is not prune logs, structural logs, it's the utility grade log. And so we really need a processing sector in New Zealand that has the ability to take that low grade fibre, utility grade log, and turn it into a product.
Where do your logs
And
come
what do you
from? I
put
mean,
it?
do they come
Can I
from
put
the
it
forest
made of
that surrounds
woody?
Kawerau?
Yep, they all come from the central North Island.
So they're cut down and they're trucked just up the road to your factory.
Correct.
Which, which makes so much more sense, and I think people find it really hard to understand that the majority of our trees are cut down, trucked over or sent by Kiwi Rail to one of the ports, then shipped over. The logs, the raw material is shipped to mostly China,
80% China.
80% China, then made into whatever it is, perhaps cut down to decking timber, and then shipped back here because it's cheaper for us to buy that decking timber that's made in China than it is for a factory here to do it.
What you described is probably almost true, except for the fact that probably very little of the logs that are going to China are coming back here, to be honest, as timber. The more likely scenario is that they're using Chilean pine to make a product and sending that product to us.
Oh, that's even crazier.
Yeah, so the timber would be processed in Chile, sent to China, remanned there, sent inland 4 or 6 hours, sent back to the port 4 to 6 hours, containerised and sent back. Most of our wood, I'd say that between 55-60% of the logs that you see are used in very, very low applications, low value applications. They're used for concrete formwork in the construction sector in China. And then at the end of 3 to 5 uses of that formwork, they'll be burnt, they'll be destroyed. So the other 30% is probably used in plywood, and then the balance would be used in some of the applications you're talking about. See, the problem is for a New Zealand log that's sent to China is that it's going to get sap stained, it's going to deteriorate. So from the moment you cut a tree down, you're going to have deterioration, and that deterioration means that the utilisation of that product is relatively low value. And so that's the challenge for New Zealand, because the brand for our wood globally is that it's low value, and we're not doing anything to transform the perception of that.
What is different about you?
I think there's 2 things that make us different to other wood processors. Firstly, we're a family business. We're owned by all Bay of Plenty families who are really passionate about our region, and we feel a great sense of responsibility to our region. And so for us, returns are important, but they're not everything. And I'd say the second thing is that in our quest to transform our industry, the wood processing industry, we've had to embark on a journey, and that's led us towards a business model which focuses on mass customization.
In other words, producing what the customer wants in bulk. Sequel, which employs 80 people, is a primary producer. That means it takes timber cut from nearby forests and processes it for customers in 20 countries. They're the secondary producers. They turn it into the finished product, like furniture. For example, one of Sequel's customers makes IKEA furniture from the timber processed at its Kawerau mill. Which comes back to the question, why are we abandoning a sector that supplies jobs, keeps the forestry industry alive, and contributes more to the economy?
At its root cause, it comes down to policy settings. While I would say that we're doing well, I wouldn't classify it as a great success story. I'd say that it's a really challenging industry to be involved in, and it's required us to be really dynamic, nimble, and selfless as investors in the process of developing this business. If you were only looking for financial return, you wouldn't do what we've done. So the reason why we've been able to grow and succeed is because as a group of shareholders, we're motivated by more than shareholder return. So the policy settings all sit around a range of different things, but at its core, the fact that we operate in New Zealand within an environment of policy disadvantage, and there's multiple facets to that, but ultimately it rests on the distortion that exists in the log trade in New Zealand.
There's that phrase again, distortion in the log trade. The argument is that China prefers logs to processed wood because it wants to create jobs in factories for its own people. So it offers VAT rebates, subsidised energy and electricity, and more. Here's how Turner explains it.
My observation of New Zealand bureaucracy is that we're basically sending checkers players to the global chess tournament, and our checkers players are playing to certain rules, believing them to be true and in the best for New Zealand, but it's a different game. And so that other game is about the different motivators and drivers. So our team is motivated by ideology, the other team is motivated by some outcomes.
Are you saying that most of our logs are going to China as raw material, and that China is able to process those logs into something and then sell them on because China's government invests a lot into the factories, the people, whereas in New Zealand there is no real investment by the government? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, I'd say it's even more than that. It's what you've described, but I would say at a even high level, it's China's operating strategically, we're operating very transactionally. So there are a number of benefits to process a New Zealand log in China. New Zealand is pretty much the only country in the world now that allows unfettered access to your logs. So the first way that China enables more demand for raw materials versus value adders and their VAT rebates, VAT differentials, so using their VAT system to encourage domestic importation of raw materials rather than value-added goods. And then there's a lot of domestic subsidisation that takes place. So there's the VAT rebates that we've talked about, but there's also electricity benefits, logistics benefits. You know, one of our customers is based about 4 hours drive out of Xiamen, and I said to them, how on earth can you manage to get our product all the way into central China and then all the way back to New Zealand and be competitive? And they said, all of our transport's free.
And that's what we're up against in a market that we're so hugely dependent on. But Turner says the one thing that's most difficult for the New Zealand sector to get its head around is this.
The differential between the retail price and the wholesale price of logs in China, which has emerged over the last few years. And that is that, the wholesale price that we get set against has been above the retail price that those logs are sold for quite some time. And that varies quite wildly. So it could at times be up to $20 US a tonne cheaper in China than the wholesale price.
Hang on, so I just need to sort of figure that out. Can you explain that to me again?
Yeah, so
Would
if
you
you pay
mind
$100 for a
unpacking
log
that?
in the wholesale market,
Unpack it
it's
for
then
me,
sold for
because I'm
$90
nearly
in the
done.
market.
So the
Oh, I
wholesaler
can't
is
get
losing
a
money
candle
on the
with
log.
plywood
Correct.
And who is the
in my
wholesaler?
brain.
Well, increasingly it's Chinese state-backed wholesale.
Oh, I see. So they're absorbing the loss.
Well, they would argue that they're just losing money, but certainly there's a large range of views as to who's funding these losses and why they're happening. But there is unanimous view
I know
of
why.
is that these losses are
Because they're
occurring.
not
So
plywood
the
pans,
differential
John.
between the wholesale and the retail price for logs is very real, and it
And
has
they
a
want to
significant
logs.
impact on New Zealand because New Zealand
Maybe they need to
processes
start
are
planting
benchmarked against the wholesale sale price,
eight
not the
more
retail price
growth.
in China.
And Turner says that's a big risk to our forestry industry. As China gets wealthier, as people want to buy things, but New Zealand isn't making them.
We're going to see this preference shift
Yes, and it
in
doesn't make
China
you want.
towards higher value product as
Oh,
they transition their economy, which is their
yes.
stated goal. And as they do that, they won't demand logs anymore, they'll demand products. And we've destroyed our product capability here.
Oh, that's good.
And I think the second piece is
That's
recognition
really,
that
really good.
China's stated goal is to be fibre self-sufficient by 2035. So they closed their own forests in 2015. They've set themselves some significant environmental objectives, and so they've embarked on a very planned process which sees them
Well, they do
have sufficient
seem to plan.
sequestration domestically in China
Maybe New
and
Zealand could
fibre
learn from
self-sufficiency
them.
by
Maybe we could
2035.
plan.
So where does that leave us as a country when you think about
Don't say that.
this moment in time where we've got highly distorted demand and prices as a consequence, a domestic industry that can't compete globally as a function of the fact that they're not buying logs at a market price, they're buying it at a distorted price. And then as they continue to struggle by 2035, so we're embarking on a real journey ourselves as a country around using trees as a form of carbon sequestration to deliver our own objectives under the Paris Accord and our Carbon Neutral 2050 Act. So with trees such a big part of our strategy, our ability to transform those trees or turn those trees into a product must be central to the strategy in my mind.
The government's working on a multi-million-dollar rescue package for West Coast sawmills.
Industry sources say the West Coast timber industry is simply dying as it runs out of wood.
3 sawmills have closed this year, costing nearly $80 billion, and more sawmills are threatened.
I believe the West Coast sawmilling industry for decades now has been treated abysmally.
Wayne Coffey says in general it is high noon for the whole industry and only the strong players will survive.
Wood processors have been warning for some years that offshore companies are buying up entire forests. The industry says log supply in Northland is projected to halve from almost 5 million to just under 2.5 million tonnes in the next 6 years, triggering mill closures and job losses.
Unless we make some changes, we're going to have a lot of farms, a lot of communities and a lot of jobs lost as we move through the next decade because the wood's just not going to be there for us. And unless we get some political intervention and change, I think Northland's going to suffer hugely. But we mustn't lose sight whilst we're thinking long term about what we do immediately, and that's a problem that's acute in Northland and increasing elsewhere in the country.
I feel like I've been reporting on this story about the wood processing industry and the progressive governments promising to do something about it to boost the industry, to create more value-added processing in New Zealand, and yet it hasn't really happened.
It's never happened, and they talk about it a lot, and I talk about it a lot with them, and every time I talk about it with them, they leave me with this great sense of hope. One of my meetings a couple of years ago, I left the beehive absolutely certain that change is imminent, but 2 years on, we managed to get a couple of reports and some trips to China, but no real change. So there are so many simple things that we do in this country that are difficult for us all to understand. Just simple things like looking at our own supply chain costs. So, you know, for me to use KiwiRail from Kawerau to the Port of Tauranga is materially more expensive for the same service than it is for log. So why would KiwiRail ostensibly subsidise raw material exports? It's very difficult for anyone outside of probably Kiwirau to understand that. And certainly if you go to another country, the idea that a state-owned enterprise would differentially price in the favour of a raw material would be considered absurd.
So what needs to happen here? I mean, is it all about more subsidies for operators here?
The easy thing to say is, there's one thing, but there's not. My catchphrase is that when you manage a plant or you manage a business, people always want to know what the silver bullet was and how you changed things, how you turned it around. And I always liken it to a...
Oh, lichen is selling lichen now. That's very clever.
But it's only
Pandas
until
are
you
like
final thing out
lichen.
that the water starts to really
They
flow.
eat lichen,
And
don't they?
so it is with wood products.
I just
There's
love
lots
that
of little
lichen.
things that make
I
a
like
big
lichen
difference
too.
in their entirety. So, look, I think the first thing is to recognise that our trade in logs is highly distorted. That was confirmed by an independent study commissioned by MFAT, which was released in November 2019, which showed as one of the most distorted markets that they've ever identified. So how we then go about offsetting that distortion is a question that becomes the strategic part of who we are as a nation, what we value and how we integrate with the rest of the world. And, the answer to power trade policies and mercantilism isn't to adopt their policies. We should never abandon the ideals that we hold with free trade. So we need to do multiple things. One of the things that we need to do is we need to better lever our relationship with China. So our notion of Guanxi, we have very strong Guanxi with China.
What exactly is Guanxi, and what makes this Chinese phrase so special that it got included in the Oxford Dictionary? While it is commonly translated as connection or compared to the idea of networking in Western culture, Guanxi entails much more about how individuals, businesses, and a government interact and function in the Chinese society.
Everything in China is related to trust and related to Guanxi, which is interpersonal connections.
Might be politically linked, or maybe to do with a local business communities where they have developed long-term quality relationship in the past.
We were the first country in the world to give them market status under the WTO. There are a number of firsts that New Zealand and China share, but we need to make sure that relationship is actually in each of our best interests. And we know that for a number of reasons, if both New Zealand and China move towards our comparative advantage in the wood product sector, the individuals within both countries would be better off. So New Zealand needs to focus on primary processing. China needs to focus on secondary processing. Primary processing is energy intensive and capital intensive. It is not labour intensive. We've got a small amount of people, but we've got renewable energy. In China, they've got a lot of people, and they've got very expensive energy with energy issues around sustainability. So secondary processing is much better placed there in their economy because they've got the people that can handle a labour-intensive process, what secondary processing is. The second thing, though, is we need to make some significant changes internally. So we need to think about how we can internally offset the degree of distortion that exists today. And the government's currently pursuing a process called industry transformation, and they have a blueprint of how they can do this in a way